Hi, I'm Sandra Brown with the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction and Public Pathology Education. This is the second in a series of talks that I'm doing about the narcissistic and psychopathic abuse field. So in the last talk, I began talking about that the book you see behind me, How to Spot a Dangerous Man, had a chapter in there that began the conversation about the dangerousness of relationships with personality disordered people and partners. Specifically, the Cluster B group. And it began the dialogue about the dangerousness in intimate partner relationships with narcissists and psychopaths. Following that book was this book, which was the first edition of Women Who Love Psychopaths Inside the Relationships of Inevitable Harm. This book was referenced as the seminal book, which means the first book that launched the look at description of pathological love relationships with cluster Bs, with borderline narcissists, antisocial personality disorders, and the disorder of psychopathy. So in the earlier talk, I talked about that the Institute has been working in this field for 30 years. While it seems like narcissistic abuse is just a new thing, it is not a new thing. The awareness of it has certainly been prolific, but I don't think people realize that there's been a lot of study, behind it. So following this book, the first edition of this book with a Dangerous Man book came out in 2005 that began the conversation about the emotional predator typology, which was the abusive, dangerous relationship with narcissists and psychopaths. And then this was the book that talked about the relationship dynamics, the traits in the survivor that was being targeted, and some of the trauma that the survivors experienced. This book came out in 2008. Then it came out in the following year, in 2009, as we were still going through a lot of the information that we have collected over the years, working with survivors in a trauma program developed for them. And then the latest of the same book, same title, it is this white cover. So when we hold them like this, you can see that each book was more detailed than the one before, culminating with this, which is 422 pages. And it's not stories, it's data. So, and explanations on the relationship dynamics, etc. So I began this series because there's so much that's being taught that is not based on the real science of this. And like I said, there's a lot of assumptions by people that this is sort of new information and we don't have a lot to go on, and everybody's just sort of winging it and sort of figuring it out. We don't need to recreate the wheel. There's been a lot of study in this, at least in my career, over 30 years. And so as the book that sort of launched this, I've been weighing in on some of the stuff that's being taught out there by other survivors or bloggers or whatever that is not in tune and not reflective of the kinds of stuff that we really do know about these relationships. So I'm going to move the screen for a minute. I was in the process of moving some of my data and stuff to my other office, and it was all sitting here ready to be moved. And so I thought this is a really good way of taking a look at some of the data that we've been collecting over the last couple of decades on symptom survivors, on the relationship dynamics, on the personality traits of survivors that are being targeted, and the cognitive dissonance is the #1 symptom survivors experience in these pathological relationships. So I'm going to move the screen for a minute so we can take a look. Okay, so that's not data that was collected last year or whenever narcissistic abuse became the hot topic. That's a career's worth. I've never worked in another field. I've just done this. And so the good news is that there is some science to this. There's a lot of information that has been collected. There is a true understanding of these relationships and the harm of these relationships. Unfortunately, and sort of the bad news of this is I don't know where a lot of these writers, survivors, bloggers, coaches are getting whatever it is that they're teaching, but it's not from this. It's not from what we do know. So, so this series was started as a way of sort of correcting this hysterical movement about narcissistic abuse, that everybody's a narcissist, that everybody's neighbor and partner and parent and doctor and dog are all narcissistic. And we've gotten very far away from the tenets of this theory and data and study and research that we really do have, that we don't need to guess, that we can actually go by stuff that we do know. And so, so today I want to talk about one particular thing that I see out there. And there's a lot of survivors, you know, that realized what kind of relationship they were in and have become passionate about sharing that awareness. The unfortunate part of that is that that passion doesn't always translate it into education. And what I mean by that is that I think the strength of the recognition about what these relationships are is in the accurate understanding of the psychopathology of the person, the understanding of the personality disorders that help survivors get their level of expectation about change equal to the level of the partner's disorders. And in order to do that, survivors, new survivors out there, need real information about these disorders because they are making life-changing, life-altering decisions about leaving, taking their children, how to leave. These are some dangerous relationships. So when survivors who aren't trained in psychopathology just start labeling their ideas or assumptions about the disorders, you get wrong information. I read stuff that these personality disorders, you know, are delusional and psychotic, and which is not normally the case with these disorders. And then they overgeneralize. Everybody who says something that hurts your feelings is narcissistic. They list these long, I see these memes with all these behaviors that they attribute to narcissism. And they are dysfunctional behaviors that you see in lots of people with other mental health problems or addictions. It is not specific to narcissism. And so it doesn't help a new survivor out there who's trying to wrap their head around these pathological, what this is, these pathological love relationships, and make these really big life-altering decisions when they don't have accurate information. And so it does matter. If a survivor is thinking that their partner does have a cluster B personality disorder or psychopathy, it's important that they really, really know that through good information, because the dangerousness, you know, involved with these kinds of disorders has a lot to do with the impulse control problems that these disorders have. And it's why these disorders are so highly connected to recidivistic behavior. So whatever it was that they did before in another relationship, you know, they do again. And that in some of their violent behavior, getting sent to better intervention or anger management does not rectify the situation, and because they are the personality types and disorders most prone to recidivistic behavior, and in many cases, lethal behavior. So, you know, when a new survivor is trying to figure out how to leave a very dangerous person, they're getting information from survivors that is not accurate and not helping them to defend against the lethal, potentially lethal problem that they are going to face in the leaving of it. And so that it becomes for me, an ethics issue that while you're passionate because maybe you had this experience, that it's unethical and maybe unsafe to use information that's not accurate, that other people reading it are going to depend on in order to make a decision to risk their life and leave, take their children away from a parent, go to court and probably spend years in court. And also having to find help, you know, for the trauma they have experienced in these relationships. And so the quality of that information matters. But what I see out there, it is not what personality disorders is. It's an overgeneralizing of symptoms that could be bipolar. It could be an addict. It could be a depressed person. It could be someone who's passive aggressive but doesn't have a personality disorder. So that is the kind of dangerous places I think the field is treading into. We have lost, you know, our concept in understanding of narcissism, and as such, it's getting increasingly hard. As someone who is an educator on this and who has spent their whole career trying to raise the level of awareness, we are losing people in droves that roll their eyes about flying monkeys and gray rocking and all this ridiculous stuff that they think that narcissistic, psychopathic, pathological relationships is based on. And it's nothing in my big stack of research that is stuff that we need to be focusing on in that way. And so people are just getting turned off with this. I get a lot of media calls, you know, people asking, you know, for television or radio, you know, expertise and wanting to know, is this really a real thing? Like, we know that, you know, narcissism is in the DSM, the diagnostic, you know, manual, but what we see out there, is this like a real thing or not? And so, sadly, we are losing survivors who get turned off with this generalization and that they can't get real psychopathology, education, and information. We are losing therapists that we are trying to gain to train, because survivors say there are not enough accurately trained therapists out there. And we're, you know, trying to recruit and get other trauma therapists to be interested in this, to get trained in it, to take it seriously, which they have a hard time taking seriously, flying monkeys and gray rocks. Who could blame them? So we've gotten really far away from what we do know about this. And as someone who spent 30 years trying to raise awareness of this, it breaks my heart to see what has happened to a lifelong life investment of all this data that is available to us to really know and to really help survivors. And so if you are a new survivor, newly into recovery, please take the steps to institute utilizing accurate pathology information, because it's from that information that you are going to not only try to build your recovery from that understanding, which is not about flying monkeys and gray rocks, and from which you need to understand these disorders very deeply, because these are the kinds of people that you are leaving that are dangerous to leave and dangerous for your children, and what you need to know about going into court with them, etc. It does matter. There are places in recovery and in support communities where other survivors are great resources. I'm starting to think this is not one of the areas, just by the lack of quality of information that I see out there. If it matters to you to build a healthy and effective recovery off of understanding these disorders, the trauma that you have been through, the traits in yourself that have been targeted, and how to safely navigate and leave partners who have high recidivism, high lethality, and poor impulse control, go to a professional, not a survivor's story. Their story is important, and there is a place for that story, especially in their own healing, but I don't know that it's the best place for new survivors trying to get the kind of information that they need in order to make the decisions they need to make in their recovery. And so that's a hard thing to talk about. You know, I've spent 30 years plus, you know, supporting these survivors in their recovery and encouraging them to lend a hand to other survivors. What has become evident is that there are some limitations with that. And so it's a hard conversation to have when you have been so supportive of survivors and connected to them and believe in their strength for recovery. But there are limitations with their understanding of psychopathology. So I wanted to sort of set the record straight on that. I see this very much as a field in which survivors need to find a trauma therapist. Some of the symptom surveys that we have done with survivors have indicated that 75% of them emerge with a trauma disorder in need of true trauma-informed care, trauma-trained therapist type care. And so that's the best avenue that we've found, you know, over the course of all of this research in understanding the needs of survivors in this genre of narcissistic and psychopathic abuse. So I wanted to stop by and give my 2 cents on that, that this is going to be a series of talks about what I said and what I meant when I wrote the first book about this for survivors well over a decade ago. So I hope you'll check back. I'm going to keep digging in and talking about what we do know as opposed to a lot of the crazy stuff that's out there. So share this for other survivors to be able to find the real core tenets of this genre of victimization. So thanks for joining me. I am Sandra Brown, and with the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction. Our website is saferelationshipsmagazine.com. Thanks.